Why is the world so divided right now? With an election just about to take place in the United States, political division is front and center. We think about politics as a battle between the left and the right, between liberals and conservatives. Even though reality is actually much more complex than that, this idea of a split in politics between the left and the right just won't go away. It's particularly common in the West. Other parts of the world are split in other ways. For example, there are two states both claiming to be China. There's Palestine and Israel, and there's North and South Korea. And interestingly enough, these issues, these divisions, seem to be coming to a head right now. And we seem to be heading into a new Cold War, a return to a time in which the world is split into two oppositional camps. But why? Well, I think there's an astrological explanation for this. And in my most recent live stream for World Astrology Report members, I explained what it is. And I've decided to share some of that live stream for you on YouTube for free. This presentation was followed by a Q&A, which I addressed member questions on topics including the age of Aquarius, the 2026 basket configuration, and the prospect of war between North and South Korea. Members also get access to all previous live streams and exclusive ad-free extended versions of all my videos since May. And they get access to the War Room, a private forum in which we're discussing the astrology and issues we get into on this channel, and much more. If you're interested in subscribing, then head to www.worldastrologyreport.com. And there's something else. If you've been interested in signing up but you never got around to it, now really is the time to do it because I'm offering a Halloween sale. Use the offer code SPOOKY20 to get 20% off on membership fees. This means that if you sign up for a year, right now you will save a fantastic 33% on membership fees. So fill your boots and bear in mind this sale won't last forever. So without further ado, here's the presentation. Please do give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy it. Don't worry, I'll be back again very soon with more content in the usual high production value style. Okay, so I've called this presentation World of Twins, Living in an Age of Bifurcation. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that and a little bit about how our world, as it currently stands, is permeated with twins of various kinds and why that is. So, obviously, I don't need to tell most of you that there is an election coming very soon in the United States of America at a time of, I would say, quite great polarization. And we tend to divide politics in the West and in other places, but mostly in the West into the quote-unquote left and quote-unquote right. The left and right. This is how we think about politics and how we think about how our societies are governed. Now, these terms, left and right, they're obviously problematic in some ways. Their meaning seems to change over time. What the different parties stand for seems to shift over time. And a lot of people's politics can't be easily put into a box of left or right, but nevertheless, it is quite fundamental to how we tend to think about politics all over the place, really, in many, many countries. And if you think about it, that's quite weird. Like, why is it that this is how politics and how our societies are arranged? Why is it like that at this time? You can imagine that, I don't think the ancient Egyptians, had a left and a right wing. I don't think the ancient Chinese did. This is a phenomenon of our times. And what is it? It's really a bifurcation. And that's what we're going to get into in this presentation. Just thinking about why is it that our society or our global societies are sort of split in various ways, and what that means and what we can glean from that. So this left and right political split that we have, as I said, mostly in the quote-unquote West, but not only, That's the split that we have in, say, if we can call it Western civilization, or one of them. But if we look at some other parts of the world, we see different kinds of split that have to do with how societies are arranged. So, for example, we have China and Taiwan. We have two countries here that are both claiming to be the legitimate China. So the Chinese, the ancient Chinese civilization has somehow come to be split in two, which is rather interesting. Now, we obviously also have a very prominent split in Israel, Palestine, the occupied territories, the West Bank, Gaza. Israel and Palestine is another split that's very prominent in geopolitics today, that obviously is very much on a lot of people's minds for obvious reasons. We also have Korea, another civilization that's split into North and South Korea. We have India and Pakistan, formerly one state, and India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, actually. So we had a split of a state, which then split again. So we have one becoming two, becoming three, essentially, in the case of India. But once again, we have a civilization that's bifurcated, that's split, that's separated into two siblings or twins, if you like. So this phenomenon seems to crop up in different ways all over the world at the moment. Now, why could this be? I think some of you, if you follow my work, you probably have an idea of where I'm going to be going with this, and why what my theory is on why this is the case. And it has to do with the synodic cycle of Pluto and Neptune, which I've decided to call the master cycle. This is the synodic cycle that we get from the movements of the two slowest moving, let's call them both planets, let's call Pluto a planet, the sort of the core planets in the astrological toolbox. This is the slowest synodic cycle, which is a cycle that we get from the movement of two planets relatively from the perspective of Earth. This is a cycle that lasts about 495 years. You could think of it as having to do with collective belief and power structures, Neptune and Pluto. This is a description of the Pluto-Neptune cycle from Palden Jenkins, who's an astrologer. He has a website. It's very, very interesting, www.palden.co.uk. And he's done a lot of really great writing on planetary synodic cycles over long periods of time. And I just took a little clip from his site here, which I recommend you visit. He says, Neptune-Pluto cycles last about 495 years, half a millennium. They characterize an underlying driving force behind history, an undertow of reality which marries the inevitable ram force of Pluto with the imaginal, ideational power of Neptune. This combined force helps us define our underlying historical reality on a collective unconscious level. This worldview and body of collective experience being a combination of actualities and perceptions. So it's very deep stuff, this cycle. It's the fundamental forces which drive civilizational change. And so here I'm going to present a little hypothesis about Pluto-Neptune conjunctions in the sign of Gemini. And my little hypothesis is that Pluto-Neptune cycles that begin in Gemini produce splits, dualities, bifurcations in collectives. And bifurcations also bring multiplicities. So I have a little illustration of cellular division here, which shows how one cell splits and becomes two cells become four, and so on. So this is why with the sign of Gemini, it has to do with dualities, but then also multiplicities, because dualities can always become multiplicities through this process of cellular division. And why am I talking about Pluto-Neptune conjunctions in Gemini. Well, that's the sign that these conjunctions are taking place in now. This is something I've talked about quite a lot on the channel, so those of you that are more familiar with my work are going to know what I'm talking about here. I'm going to quickly review some of the ground we've covered on the channel before now, but then we're going to get into some new territory as well, don't worry. But we had, so the way these conjunctions work is that you tend to get several in a single sign, and then they move to the next sign. So for example, we had, I think it was 3 in the sign of Aries. So they come every roughly 500 years or so. So if we had a 1500-year stretch of time in which they were taking place in Aries, then in about, I think it's about 900 BC, something like that, they moved into Taurus. And then we had, since then, we had 5 conjunctions in Taurus spanning about 2,500 years. And in 1398, they moved into Gemini. And that initiated another one of these 500-year cycles, but the first one in the sign of the twins. And that's for a very long time indeed, for thousands and thousands of years. Now, again, these are very slow, powerful conjunctions, and they're going to color the times in very profound ways. And so now we're in a period of time, well, since 1398, we've seen the times be given this kind of Gemini flavor. Now, again, this is an example that I've given on the channel before. Around the time of these conjunctions that happened, these first Pluto-Neptune conjunctions in Gemini, 1398 and 1399, what happened in Europe at this time? We had this thing called the Western Schism between 1378 and 1417. Now, you might notice how that time period is almost centered exactly on 1398, 1399. So something that I tend to emphasize a bit in looking at cycles is how the events, things that happen around the time of a conjunction, then tell you what's going to happen over the course of the cycle. They foreshadow events that are coming. They show you, essentially, they're a little microcosm of this cyclical macrocosm. And so at this time we have this thing called the Western Schism or the Papal Schism. And essentially what happened is that the Roman Catholic Church split, and you had bishops residing in Rome and Avignon in France, simultaneously claiming to be the true Pope. And they were eventually joined by a third line of Pisan claimants in 1409. So you see how there we have a bifurcation, which then a duality, which then leads to a multiplicity. We have another split, and we get, a third claimed Pope in 1409. So what we see is that we have this big, powerful conjunction in Gemini, and the church, which until before that time had essentially held spiritual sway over the whole of Europe, had become split. You've got 2 factions claiming to have legitimacy over the church. And around the same time, you also have these figures appearing, these early church reformers. Jan Hus and John Wycliffe are the main 2 that I want to talk about. This is an excerpt from Wikipedia about Jan Hus, who was a Czech. Jan Hus was a Czech theologian and philosopher who became a church reformer and the inspiration of Hussitism, a key predecessor to Protestantism, and a seminal figure in the Bohemian Reformation. Hus is considered to be the first church reformer, even though some designate the theorist John Wycliffe. Wycliffe was an English scholar. He lived he was alive at the same time as Hus, died a bit before him. But then it says, his teachings had a strong influence, most immediately in the approval of a reformed Bohemian religious denomination, and over a century later on Martin Luther. So again, we've got events happening here at the time of these powerful conjunctions, which are foreshadowing things that are going to come. What comes is the Protestant Reformation. So 1517, we have Martin Luther nailing his 95 Theses to the church door, All Saints Church in Wittenberg. And this kicks off the Reformation, essentially, which is going to lead to a split in the church. just as was foreshadowed at the conjunction. So I have a map here. It's from Encyclopedia Britannica, and it's showing predominant religions in Europe by the mid-16th century. So these brown areas are Roman Catholic, but now we have all these other sort of branches off of branches of Christianity. We have the Lutheran Church, the Calvinist Church, the Church of England. So these new religions and this split in Christendom happens following these conjunctions, and it's all foreshadowed by these by the events that happen around the time of the conjunctions of 1398 and 1399, which for me just blows my mind. I just think it's absolutely incredible. It's the kind of thing where I just wish historians were aware of this, or could sort of add this to their thinking. But we're not quite there yet, unfortunately. But hopefully someday we will get there. What else do we see in this 500-year cycle? Well, 1492, we have I'm going to use scare quotes again, but the quote-unquote discovery of America, of the New World. So it's a new world, but you could also consider that a second world. We have this whole other kind of half or hemisphere of the world that's suddenly uncovered, at least to European eyes at that time. Obviously, this is a somewhat challenged notion in different ways. Obviously, because there were people already living there, and also because there were a lot of claims that this wasn't really the discovery of the New World, even from the European perspective, that people had been there before. And this is something that really blew my mind when I found this out in a book by Joseph Farrell, if you've read any of his crazy books. But so there's this figure that was lived from 1345 to 1400, Prince Henry Sinclair, the first Earl of Orkney. Orkney is an island off the coast of Scotland, and this is you can see we have a statue of this guy, Henry Sinclair, and I have a book here that you can get on Amazon. I haven't read this book, but it's called Prince Henry Sinclair: His Expedition to the New World in 1398. And I've got this excerpt here from a Scottish tourism website. The modern stone nearby reads, Prince Henry I Sinclair of Orkney, born in Scotland, made a voyage of discovery to North America in 1398. After wintering in Nova Scotia, he sailed to Massachusetts, and on an inland expedition in 1399 to Prospect Hill to view the surrounding countryside, one of the party died. So there are renegade scholars, let's call them, who believe that this character here made a voyage to the New World in 1398, which is just quite incredible, because I was talking about these foreshadowings that we see. 1398 is the year of the first Pluto-Neptune conjunction in Gemini, and supposedly this figure, this guy, discovered North America before Columbus did, which is just quite incredible. And this is whether or not he did visit Massachusetts is disputed, of course, but I would say that this is an instance of where perhaps we can use astrology as kind of to do sort of detective work and to establish whether or not something is true or not. This, to me, rather suggests that he did actually visit North America in 1398. Because it would make sense then as a foreshadowing of what was going to come in this later in this cycle in 1492. So these foreshadowings, for me, it's a really powerful predictive technique, and it often seems to work like clockwork, frankly. Another figure of this time was a guy called Prince Henry the Navigator, Portuguese nobleman, who essentially launched Portuguese naval exploration of the world. They started to sail around Africa, establish colonies on the coast and so forth. And this was kind of around the time of these conjunctions As you can see, this Henry the Navigator was born in 1394. We also see, even at a better known kind of less, or at a level that isn't disputed by historians, let's say, we see a foreshadowing of sort of, let's say, European exploration and colonialism and so forth around this time. Now, what else happens in this cycle? Well, we have the French Revolution of 1789. This is the storming of the Bastille, famous painting, which I'm sure you've seen before. What were Pluto and Neptune doing on this date, 14th of July, 1789? Well, they were pretty close to a trine. If you see, I've got the charts here with Pluto at 18 degrees of Aquarius, Neptune at 20 degrees of Libra. That's just 2 degrees from an exact trine. They were in the 18th century, Pluto and Neptune had a long trine, much in the same way that they've been in a long sextile for the last 80, 90 years or so. 80 years. So yeah, at this trine, we have the French Revolution. Now, why am I just bringing up the French Revolution? Well, this is where we get the idea of the left and the right from. So this is an excerpt from an article on this subject that I found. Today, the terms left wing and right wing are used as symbolic labels for liberals and conservatives, but they were originally coined in reference to the physical seating arrangements of politicians during the French Revolution. The split dates to the summer of 1789, when members of the French National Assembly met to begin drafting a constitution. The delegates were deeply divided over the issue of how much authority King Louis XVI should have, and as the debate raged, the two main factions each staked out territory in the Assembly Hall. The anti-royalist revolutionaries seated themselves to the presiding officer's left, while the more conservative aristocratic supporters of the monarchy gathered to the right. So this is where we get this idea of the left and the right, which is, really obviously has survived to this day and completely dominated how we think about politics for quite a long time. And the original meaning of the left and the right has kind of stayed to some degree constant, in the sense that you had anti-royalist revolutionaries on the left and conservative aristocratic supporters of the monarchy, so supporters of the, let's say the status quo or the old ways on the right. So once again, we have a bifurcation in this Pluto-Neptune cycle that began in Gemini, and it's one that's completely colonized how we think. Now, another bifurcation, I think, that came over the course of that cycle was that you had the emergence of science and religion. You had this idea that there's this thing called religion, and it can be put in its sort of box on the side, and it has nothing to do with science, which is, both of these two things have different domains over which they have dominion. They answer different questions, and that's very much how we see things today. And so over the course of this cycle, we had figures emerging. I've pictured some of them here. So on the left, we have Copernicus, came up with the heliocentric theory. Then we have Galileo, who backed the heliocentric theory and got in a lot of trouble with the church. And of course, we have Charles Darwin, whose theory of evolution did a lot of damage to the power of creationist narrative, shall we say. And then finally we have Nietzsche here, who proclaimed in the late 19th century that God is dead and we have killed him, and all of that. So we had the emergence of science over this period, and we had it split from the spiritual realm, so shall we say. The early scientists, the people who pioneered things like astrology and astronomy, tended to be, both scientists and mystics, so they didn't really separate these things. Astrology and astronomy were, of course, one thing back in the day, as we all know. And we gradually had these things separating from each other. And that's rather the situation we had until quite recently. I think that the current cycle might be about changing that. But that previous cycle that began at those conjunctions in 1398 and 99 was about these things being torn apart, so to speak. So 1891 and 92, a new Gemini cycle begins. So in the late 19th century, as I've mentioned many times, we have a fresh conjunction of these planets, three conjunctions in 1891 and 1892 at 8 degrees of Gemini. So you can see that the previous one was at 3 degrees. We've moved a few degrees into Gemini. That's how these conjunctions work. They creep forward through the sign and then eventually exit the sign for the next one every 500 years. And I've also shown in my chart here, I've got Jupiter and Saturn as they were in the first of these 3 conjunctions, almost precisely opposing each other. Jupiter in Pisces and Saturn in Virgo. And I find this opposition in this chart really interesting and telling. To me, it seems to speak to the kind of opposition between science and spirit. Saturn in Virgo being, having to do with perhaps the work to figure out how the physical world is constituted, through the scientific method. Saturn having to do with science and scientists, and then Jupiter here in Pisces. It's sign of domicile traditionally, and they're in opposition, and I find that really, really interesting in that chart. So, what great bifurcations have we seen in this cycle? So we had a few in the first 500-year cycle. Now, the great bifurcation of the 20th century was this great battle between the US-led sort of West, shall we say, the capitalist bloc, maybe it's better to call it that, and the communist bloc, led by the USSR, Russia. So we had almost the whole world split between these two blocks, as can be seen in this map here. So we have another great bifurcation of the world in a different way to what we saw in the previous cycle, because now we're in a globalized world by this time. Everything, the planet had been mapped by the end of that previous cycle. The world had become integrated to a much greater extent. We had technologies of instant communication, things like radio and flight emerging at the time of the last conjunction. So this cycle that we're in now, this is the cycle of living in a truly globalized world. And as you can see, this bifurcation literally divided the whole planet into 2. Was this division of the world like this? Was this also foreshadowed in the 1890s at around the time of those last conjunctions? I need to do a bit more research on this because I haven't seen a super clear indication of this. However, the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party was a socialist party founded in 1898 in Minsk. This was the party that became the Bolshevik, or that split into the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. The Bolsheviks eventually, of course, led the Russian Revolution, which led to the formation of the USSR. So this was actually a big period of communist organization, the 1890s. The Second International also took place in this around this time. But at the same time, this was also the Gilded Age. So this time where these sort of titans of finance and business made enormous amounts of money. These figures like J.P. Morgan and Carnegie and Rockefeller and so forth. These figures made incredible amounts of money running or building America and running big business. A quote here on the Gilded Age: the 1880s and 1890s were years of unprecedented technological innovation, mass immigration, and intense political partisanship, including disputes over currency, tariffs, political corruption and patronage, and railroads and business trusts. I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound too different to today to me. There's quite a lot of those themes are still very much present. And that was the beginning of the cycle we're in. So it's the Gilded Age, but it's also a period of communist organization. So in that sense, I think, you can see this split perhaps emerging at that time, or becoming more prominent between capitalism and communism. Now we're going to have a look at this chart, which again I've showed you before if you've watched a lot of my videos. This is from Archetypal Explorer, and it's essentially a visualization of the Pluto-Neptune sextile. So what this shows is how, if you can look on the left-hand side, you can see a scale going from 0 to 10. This is degrees. So what this is showing is how many degrees away from an exact sextile were Pluto and Neptune over the last century or so. And what you can see is this line, wavy line, kind of coming, sort of moving upwards in the 1940s. And then there's some kind of peaks. It's the planets sort of drift apart a bit. Then there's some more peaks. Then they drift apart quite a lot. And then we have some more peaks over here. So what this is essentially showing is the Pluto and Neptune coming into sextile in the 1940s. The first major aspect of this cycle that began in 1891 and 1892. So I've just put an arrow here showing 1947, which is generally the year that people say the Cold War began, and another arrow here in 1991 when the USSR fell apart. And you can see how these two dates, they come pretty close to this sort of period here, where Pluto and Neptune are either making exact sextiles or they're still close to it. So essentially from 1950 to 1956, they were making exact sextiles, and also from 1976 and 1986, but they never got too far away from sextiles. After sort of in the 90s and the early 2000s, they separated quite a bit, to the point where they're almost getting out of orb, depending on what you use for an orb for these things. I think Richard Tarnas uses a 6-degree orb for sextiles. So by that count, they kind of moved out of orb for periods of the early, or for the 2000s, and even the early 2010s. Now, this dark line here shows where we are now, this vertical line. And you can see that we're coming back to a final period of exact sextiles between 2026 and 2032. So you can see that when these planets were in aspect, essentially, we had a bifurcated world through the Cold War. What are we going to have when they start doing that again? Of course, if you follow the news, if you follow geopolitics, you'll have heard a lot of talk about a second Cold War brewing, which is obviously, I think that looks like what's happening. And so that's very much kind of fitting with what we can almost see this happening in visual form here on this chart. We can see the sort of bifurcated world. Then we sort of move into 1991, we move into a kind of unipolar world when we have a sole superpower, the US, and that kind of order is being challenged now. So 2026 to 2032, a new Cold War. This is just a little excerpt from an article by Velina Chakarova. She's a geopolitical analyst, and she coined this name, the Dragon Bear, which is her basically her term for the alliance between Russia and China. So this article's Cold War 2.0, the US Dragon Bear standoff in a bifurcated global system. So she's using that word, bifurcated. In the contemporary geopolitical landscape, debates are intensifying over the nature and trajectory of the global order. Some analogize the current situation to the precariousness of 1914, suggesting that the world is on the brink of a Third World War. Others liken it to 1945, anticipating a new Cold War, primarily between the United States and China. However, current tensions could be placed within the framework of Cold War 2.0, emblematic of a deepening rift between the US on the one hand and the Dragon Bear modus vivendi, China and Russia on the other, amidst the bifurcation of the global system and the fourth industrial revolution. So she is talking about a new Cold War, essentially, with the US on one side and then China and Russia and various other allied states on the other. And she seems to think that a Cold War 2.0 is more likely than World War III. You know, and things look very scary right now, in my opinion. But my hope, as you've probably heard me say, is that it's more this second Cold War that we're looking at and that we're heading into. Things might get quite messy, of course, before that really solidifies in the next year or two. What other bifurcations have we had in the world? So I mentioned these at the start. We have the partition of India in 1947. We have the founding of Israel in 1948. And we have the founding of North and South Korea, also in 1948. We also have the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. So we have the emergence of this situation where you have two Chinas, you have mainland China, you have Taiwan. Isn't it amazing, though, that all these divisions come when this Pluto-Neptune sextile comes into orb? So you can see how this Gemini flavor of the Pluto-Neptune cycle is kind of asserting itself in different ways in different parts of the world, which I think is very interesting indeed. And so these are some headlines that I've taken just today from recent articles. Sheikh Hasina's exit renews concerns of India-Pakistan conflict in Bangladesh. So we mentioned India-Pakistan as being one of these bifurcated civilizations. This article was warning about the possibility of renewed rivalry between these two countries over what's going on in Bangladesh. Another headline, the two-state solution is dead. Why pretend anymore? Of course, that's about Israel and Palestine. And obviously, it doesn't need any more elaboration about what's going on there, the horrific events over there. And then we have another headline here. North Korean constitution now calls South hostile state. So there was a change to the North Korean constitution quite recently, where they are now defining the South as a hostile state. This is quite a worrying deterioration in relations between the Koreas. And I'm going to talk a lot more about Korea later in this presentation because somebody asked a question about it. So I've done a fair bit of work on that. And then we had China, this headline here, China stages blockade of Taiwan. So you might also have seen that China kind of surrounded Taiwan this month in a kind of what looked like a kind of mock attempt at a blockade, kind of to show that perhaps to practice doing it or to show that they could do it if they wanted. So you can see how all these themes that came into being when the Pluto-Neptune sextile came into orb, they kind of dissipated a bit over the course of the 90s, 2000s, early 2010s, and now they're all coming back to sort of to trouble the world once again. But let's get weirder. That's it for the excerpt of this month's live stream presentation. In the full version of the video, available at www.worldastrologyreport.com, I do indeed take this subject into weirder territory, namely exploring the possibility of a coming split in humanity between those who want to dive headlong into transhumanism and those who are more cautious of technology. And we also talk about the possible existence of a breakaway civilization. And then I answered members' questions on all sorts of interesting topics. So do consider signing up if you want access to that video and many more. And do remember to use the offer code SPOOKY20 to get 20% off membership for a limited time only. I'll be back again soon on YouTube with November's forecast video. Thank you, and see you again next time.